From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's what's coming up. K-State's Allen Featherstone will discuss the process of determining agricultural property valuation for property tax purposes here in Kansas and how landowner net income is factored into that calculation. Allen will offer his expectations for agricultural property values coming out of this calendar year, 2021. Following then from the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen, on how environmental-based circumstances can impact agricultural property valuation. He advises all parties involved in a land transaction to be aware of those possible effects. And later on, K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven with another Stop, Look, and Listen, here on Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, Amber Alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Thanks for tuning in. This is Agriculture Today. On our opening segment of this broadcast, a look at a subject that was addressed in considerable detail by our guest now at a special webinar put on by the Agricultural Economics Department at K-State a week back. This session looked at agricultural income and property tax calculations and how all of that fits together of importance to you producers. Allen Featherstone is the head of the Agricultural Economics Department at K-State. Allen, you're going to share some thoughts on where these property tax levels and the calculations that go into them will probably settle here in 2021, but what you're getting at with this was how net farm income does factor into those calculations determining those tax levels, right?
Yes, the property tax system in Kansas is based on a use value from an agricultural purpose, and it is calculated based on a net income for irrigated and non-irrigated cropland. Pasture land uses a rental rate in order to do the computations. And it is very much prescribed in law with regards to how those computations are done and what is included and what isn't included in those computations.
And this is something that you think producers should be acquainted with as they consider their property tax liabilities?
Certainly it is something that producers need to be acquainted with, but also I think just the general community in terms of sometimes because of the formulas that are used, the values seem to be diverging from what's happening in the market. And that can create confusion. It can create difficulties with those entities that rely on property tax, such as school districts, such as counties, as they fund the operations that they deem important. Sometimes when agriculture is highly profitable, the values are going down, and in some respects that causes concern on the part of those that use property tax to fund their programs. And in other times, for example, farm income is down, but yet land values are going up from a use value perspective. And so to me, I think in general, it's important to understand how the system works. And again, it's just up to the policymakers to choose the method to use to appraise agricultural land in Kansas.
Well, let us shed some light on this. How are those net income levels on the part of the landowner or the landlord, to be more precise, defined here?
Essentially, it's just a net income approach where you try to calculate what the normal return would be for the landowner. And so it's not the producer return, it's the landowner return. And so probably the best way to think about it would be a share lease type arrangement where the prices, the yields go into the calculations, and then they use the typical split. And so in some cases it would be 40-60, in other cases it would be 1/3, 2/3, just depending on what's more customary within those regions. There is the expenses that would be typically paid by the landlord, and so in some cases that would be seed costs, some cases it would not be seed costs, just what's typical in terms of the share rental arrangement within those regions. There is a management fee that is provided, and so that's taken account. Also, there's an adjustment for property tax paid, and so that's in there. Probably the big thing, or the big two items that aren't in the computation that in some respects will skew this from the income that you'll see in the farm sector. Government program payments are not in the computation, and crop insurance is not in the computation. And so you will see wider swings sometimes in those landlord net incomes than you will in actual net farm income, simply because the safety nets are not included in the computation of crop insurance. And again, to give you an indication, and this will kind of lead into a little bit with regards to where we may be looking at in 2021, the net farm income was $167,000, but of that, over $100,000 was government program payments, and so you can surmise that the landlord net incomes for the property tax computations are going to be much lower than the incomes seen by landlords.
Of course, the process can get very deep into the weeds with detail, which we won't do today, but to just suffice it to note that when computing the actual property tax, though, there's a certain formula that's used considering the income at hand.
There's a couple things in there that are important to realize in terms of the landlord net income is the numerator of the process. The other part of the process is capitalizing those rates, and so converting those to land values. This also is set by statute. After 2003, basically that capitalization rate is 11% or 12%, and that's specified in the statute. And so what you would end up doing is essentially taking the landlord net income and multiplying it somewhere between 8 or 9, depending on whether or not the rate's 11 or 12. And so if you had a $30 landlord net income, you would multiply that roughly by 9, and that would give you a use value of $270 per acre. Once those use values are calculated, essentially there's a factor of 30% that is applied on that, so you multiply that by 30%, and then after that it will be multiplied by the mill levy that is set by the either the school board or the county in terms of whoever is the taxing authority with regards to what they need.
Because incomes, as you well know, Allen, from year to year can vary so much, are there mechanisms in place within the process to even things out, so to speak, as far as tax values?
There is, and the statute uses an 8-year average to try to even that out. Mm-hmm. What's actually used now is an 8-year average of an 8-year average. And the reason that is done is essentially such that you don't get a lot of upswings or downswings in those values. It does cause a very slow adjustment process in values. There was some legislation introduced this year to change that to an 8-year average. The big thing there, and it would cause more turning points. And so what this means is that some years the use value would be up, the next year it might be down, then based on incomes again it could go up. And so again, in terms of when you're looking at agricultural values and trying to set a county budget or a school budget, certainly that up and down is kind of distasteful with regards to always needing to adjust that mill levy by a substantial amount. But again, it is something that the policymakers will look at, and ultimately they will make a decision. If they would go to an 8-year average, the values would adjust quicker, but you would have more variability. And so that's kind of the trade-off in terms of, I think there's a desire maybe to get the adjustments made quicker, but the downside is that variability such that they're going up and down, and one county may not be acting like another county just because of weather patterns. There also may be more variability across county lines and in some of those issues. And so in some respects, whether or not you use an 8-year average of an 8-year average or whether or not you use an 8-year average, ultimately the values over a long period of time will be the same. It's just how quick that adjustment is made.
That is backdrop. Let's jump then right to expectations on property valuations for agricultural producers, landowners in 2021. What does your crystal ball say about all of that, Allen?
I think in some respects you're going to see them to be relatively flat when those amounts, those valuation notices come out in March of 2022. The reason I indicate that, even with a very high income in the agricultural sector, most of that was government program payments, and they're not in the computation. And so because of that, there's actually regions in the state where net farm income in 2020 would have been negative without the government program payments. And so I think probably for 2022, when those valuations come out, they're going to be fairly flat. We will be rolling off higher years in terms of one of the years that's still in the computations is the income from 2007, which was a very high income year. And within the next 2 years, that will be rolling off. And so you're rolling off a high income year. That's pretty much across the state. And so I think there will not be upward pressure on use values probably for the next 2-3 years unless the formula is changed with regards to how the computation is made.
So that may well be welcome stability, and especially considering where our income levels are right now and all of the volatility associated with those.
One of the expenses that will be stable will be your property taxes relative to fertilizer and seed and a lot of the other expenses that producers are facing. I think the property tax will be one of the more stable items here over the next 2 or 3 years.
For further reference, we'd invite you to go to the agmanager.info website for the presentation on the webinar on 2021 agricultural net income for property tax calculations. You can see what Allen had to share in more detail right there. Allen, thanks for going over this with us.
Thanks, Eric.
He's the head of the Department of Agricultural Economics at K-State and the presenter of that webinar topic last week. Allen Featherstone on this part of Agriculture Today.
Kansas farmers and ranchers are helping feed your family in the world. The largest contributor to the Kansas economy is beef cattle. How do you get that juicy steak on your plate? In order for you to enjoy your tasty meal, it requires the hard work of the producers, marketers, advertisers, processors, inspectors, transporters, packers, and consumers. So thank all these people and sit back, relax, and enjoy your tasty meal.
Agriculture Today returns now to follow up on our conversation with K-State's Allen Featherstone on property valuation trends in Kansas. We're welcoming back in from the Washburn University School of Law, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation there, Roger McEowen. For Roger has just put out an article on his blog on valuing agricultural real estate with environmental considerations involved, Roger. This happens frequently, as a matter of fact, and it's a pretty big deal when it does.
Well, it is, Eric. Anytime we've got any type of environmental restriction or land use restriction or issue or problem, or even what other people think might be a problem with a tract of agricultural land, it can impact value. So it's unfortunate, but it is kind of a practical thing that's out there that happens more frequently than we would like for it to happen, particularly with the seemingly ever-increasing regulation of agricultural activities. Those regulatory aspects can impact value.
We want to look at some of the possible consequences there, but when we look at environmental concerns such as contamination of the land and so forth, you point out in your write-up here that that's not necessarily always tangible. It's more subjective at times.
Well, indeed, it can be subjective. I call that the stigmatization effect of a property. Even if there's no current problem associated with a property, say it's been physically cleaned up, that doesn't necessarily eliminate the loss of value that can result from that stigma that continues to attach to that property. Potential buyers might still be reluctant, and that makes the property less desirable in the marketplace. And if interested buyers can be found, lenders might be reluctant to finance the acquisition of contaminated or potentially contaminated property, or a property that is stigmatized. And that in turn could make financing more costly, and that in turn can impact market value. So external environmental factors can influence market value.
Let's talk about some specific areas in which this might fall. And one of those, again, obviously would be any sort of chemical or waste contamination that would be appearing on a piece of property. We see this quite frequently, actually, in rural America, don't we?
Oh, yeah. I remember growing up as a kid, we used to have a dump on our farm. Now, you don't those anymore. Those got cleaned up. From the 1980s on, most of those farm dumps were cleaned up, and you just don't see them anymore. But you'll still find, particularly the remote areas, you'll find a ravine that still has trash that was dumped in it. Washers and dryers and tractor parts and those types of things. You just find a ravine and you put the old equipment in the ravine. Now, that's less common these days, but the problem you get into in things like that is old machines and equipment. They might have oil in them. They may have some fuel that's left in them. That stuff leaks out, and that's what can really create the problem. The problem is not necessarily the metal itself, although you don't want to get into those things when you're harvesting crops. But it's the other associated chemicals and waste that can create problems. And frankly, there are a lot of federal as well as state environmental restrictions that are in place designed to prevent those things. But even a property that in the past had those activities on it can still have the presence of those issues today. So those types of things can impact value. And if you discover that on, say, an environmental audit, if you ask a bunch of questions of the seller as to what's happened on the property in the past, and some state laws require an environmental audit for agricultural land, it might turn up some things that can impact value. So you have to be careful. You have to perform due diligence when you're buying agricultural land to make sure that you're properly valuing it, in addition to productivity measures and soil types and those types of things. Then you get into the legal / environmental realm, and that can impact value.
A finer point associated with this, then, how cleanup costs for such a site might be viewed by the IRS in particular in regard to how those costs are handled for taxation purposes. And this is an important area here.
It is, and this is one area of the law that's really flip-flopped back and forth. The IRS, just can't make their mind up on this. Over the years, the rule on this, and it's been this way for about the last 15 years, but for the 10 years prior to that, the rule was changing every couple of years. But basically, the question is, if I buy a farm and I've got to clean it up because of some environmental rule that is being violated because of the presence of chemicals or whatever the case might be, and so I incur cleanup costs, can I get a current deduction for those costs, or do I have to capitalize those costs? In other words, take those costs, add them into my basis of the property, and only recover them with a higher income tax basis if and when I sell the property. Well, what we're talking about here are called environmental remediation costs. Now, what IRS says is that those are basically more in the nature of repairs than they are capital improvements. And so if they are repair, they are currently deducted. And that's a good rule because if you have to capitalize those costs, that's particularly rough on a lot of taxpayers because they're less capable of sustaining a large outlay for cleanup costs if you don't have an offsetting deduction for that. So, that's a big issue, and you want to make sure that you're going to be able to deduct those cleanup costs.
Absolutely. The other, high-profile aspect of this, and there's been much discussion about wetlands over the last 2 or 3 decades and how they are considered in regard to the value of a piece of property. There have been laws and regulations that have, pardon the expression, muddied the waters here, Roger.
Yeah, anytime you get any type of land use restriction, that can cause the land to be unmarketable to an extent. And if the extent is great enough, it could cause the property to become worthless. And we've had a number of cases over the years, some of which that have gone to the United States Supreme Court on the issue of whether a land use restriction rises to the level of an unconstitutional taking of the property, a regulatory taking rather than an outright physical taking of the property, such as when the government comes in and condemns some of your farms so that they can expand a road or do whatever the government wants to do. And they have the right to do that under the Constitution, but they have to pay you for it under the Fifth Amendment. Well, here we're not dealing with a physical taking of the property. The government doesn't want your farm. They just want to regulate your use of it. And so that is a constitutional question. A lot of those go through the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, and there was a fairly prominent case in 2015 where the landowner had bought the tract at issue as part of a transaction in which they were buying an entire peninsula on which the tract was located. If the restriction is significant enough, we can have a constitutional issue and invoking the Fifth Amendment. So basically where the courts are at right now in terms of this issue, and it's the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, and that is if all of the economic use of a property has been taken, then compensation must be paid. Well, a lot of our regulatory takings don't involve necessarily 100% of the economic use. There may be other uses. Well, that's where we really get into the issue. And the case in 2015 that went to the U.S. Court of Federal Claims involved the issue of whether the federal government's denial of a Section 404 permit under the Clean Water Act amounted to a constitutional taking because the landowner needed that permit to develop the property. And the court said that the denial constituted a taking, and the landowner was entitled to a little bit over $4 million in compensation. So the wetland issue is a big one, and we see this issue come up with respect to farms and ranches, particularly in the prairie pothole region of the U.S., the Dakotas, northern Iowa, Minnesota, northeast corner of Nebraska. We've had a couple of these pothole cases come out of Kansas, kind of in the Great Bend area, where the water table is very high. And that can present a lot of issues for farmers. But anytime you have hazardous waste, you have wetlands, you have endangered species on your property, that can really negatively impact value.
Well, we'd refer the listeners to your article, for there's much more detail on all of this. That's well worth a read here, and we'll tell you how to get there in just a moment. But the point here, Roger, is that producers who are involved in land transactions or maybe just in general need to be aware of these environmental influences on property value in any circumstance.
Absolutely. Do all your economic research with respect to a tract and understand the productivity of the soil, what you think your returns can be from an economic standpoint to determine your value that you're going to pay for that. But the last thing you want to have happen after you do all of that is then to not be able to use the property in the way that you can cultivate those economic returns because of some legal issue, whether it's wetlands or hazardous waste or some endangered species that's taken up residence on your property that restricts your land use. You don't want that to take all that value away that you just paid for. So these things are very important on the valuation side of things.
The article entitled Valuing Ag Real Estate with Environmental Concerns. It's in Roger's blog series at washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. As always, Roger, thanks for your time and the input.
Thank you, Eric.
Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation at the Washburn University School of Law. That's Roger McEowen. We'll be back with more. This is Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Now, in its 97th year of broadcast service to agriculture in Kansas and the Central Plains, this is the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Next up, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Kansas City Federal Reserve President Esther George says she thinks that monetary policymakers will keep interest rates low and will continue buying treasuries and mortgage-backed securities until there's more data on the ways the economy is recovering from the pandemic. She told attendees on the first day of the Fed's all-virtual 2021 Agricultural Symposium that one area of consumer behavior to watch is the trajectory of the housing market in the months and years ahead. Home prices, according to the S&P Home Price Indices, surged 13% in March on top of a 12% gain in February, some of the largest moves since 2013. There are concerns, she says, about shortages of labor and raw materials and transportation services. As for labor, how quickly people return to work depends on pandemic-related factors, she notes, such as availability of child care, enhanced unemployment benefits, and the fear of getting sick. Now, some of the shortages of materials and transportation, she goes on to say, may be resolved yet this year, but other shortages will take much longer to work out. As for how the dynamics of a strong economy and supply constraints would affect inflation, she says that inflation over the last 12 months, ending in April, measured by the Consumer Price Index, increased 4.2%. That's the fastest pace in a decade. She said many of the factors that boosted inflation over the past year will fade with time. What inflation looks like in the medium term, the next 3 to 10 years, is less certain. As the Biden administration continues to review existing water policy, environmental groups have asked a federal court to vacate the Trump administration's Navigable Waters Protection Act in a motion for summary judgment filed in South Carolina. The South Carolina Coastal Conservation League filed that motion in the U.S. District Court for the District of South Carolina. The group is asking that court to vacate the rule based on what they argue has been lost protection for waters. However, agricultural interest groups support the current rule because, in their view, it simplifies questions of Clean Water Act jurisdiction that farmers face on their land. The environmental group calls the Trump rule an arbitrary policy reversal that removed the Clean Water Act's safeguards from millions of stream miles and tens of millions of wetland acres, they say. New EPA Administrator Michael Regan testified before a House Appropriations Subcommittee on the EPA's proposed budget back in April, was questioned, you'll recall then, about the direction that the new administration is going on water regulation. Regan told that committee the current EPA has no plans to revert back to the 2015 rule. That rule faced major opposition from agriculture and other interests, leading to numerous lawsuits. A new USDA program is seeking to quantify the climate benefits of the Conservation Reserve Program. Here's the USDA's Stephanie Ho with more.
USDA is accepting proposals for a new program called the Climate Change Mitigation Assessment Initiative, which aims to quantify climate benefits of the Conservation Reserve Program.
This initiative will allow the USDA to better target climate outcomes through CRP while gaining critical data to calibrate, validate, and further improve our methods and existing models.
That was Farm Service Agency Administrator Zach Ducheneau.
Projects can cover perennial grass, tree, and/or wetland practice types, and should be a 3 to 5 year term with the potential for renewal. And we think that shorter term will further incentivize people to participate because you don't have to lock it up for 10 or 15 years, which is half a generation.
Proposals are due by July 2nd.
Applications are welcome from all types of organizations, including public, private, and nonprofit institutions. And the pre-proposals can be from a single entity or from a group of partners who coordinated efforts.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
In other headlines today, a recent ruling by a federal judge would be disastrous for small U.S. hog producers, according to the National Pork Producers Council. Left unchallenged, a recent federal district court ruling, they say, will result in a 2.5% loss in pork packing plant capacity nationwide and more than $80 million in reduced income for smaller-scale U.S. hog operations. This is according to an analysis by livestock economist Dermot Hayes of Iowa State University. The NPPC is urging the USDA to intervene before the ruling takes effect at the end of the month. That ruling, says the council, will dramatically reduce hog farmer market power, particularly smaller producers located near impacted plants, and would undermine pork industry competition. The NPPC says the court's ruling will have the opposite effect sought by those seeking to expand the number of meat packing plant facilities. Lawmakers have recently called for increasing the number of pork processing facilities nationwide by bringing smaller state plants up to federal inspection standards. These facilities represent less than 1% of total harvest capacity. Beef Month serves as an unofficial kickoff to the grilling season, and to make sure that beef remains king of the grill this summer, Scarlett Higgins reports here that the Kansas Beef Council has launched a library of grilling recipes on kansasbeef.org.
From steaks and ribs to kebabs and carnitas, consumers can find numerous possibilities to help optimize their grilling experience this summer on the Kansas Beef website. According to Kansas Beef Council Director of Marketing, Charlotte Hoeven, research shows people are looking for new recipes to add variety to their dinner tables, and one of the great things about beef is that there is a grilling cut for every budget. The recipe library also includes a few side dishes to complete the beef meals, making kansasbeef.org a one-stop shop. In addition to providing great grilling recipes, the Kansas Beef Council is collaborating with Hy-Vee grocery stores over the summer. Hy-Vee will feature in-store signage at the meat case and disseminate a custom recipe brochure. The brochure is unique as it has 8 steak recipes that highlight excellent beef cuts for grilling, combined with grilling tips and a QR code that consumers can scan with their smartphone for more information about beef production. Each QR code goes to a state-specific web page where shoppers can learn about cattle producers in each of the 8 states where Hy-Vee stores are located, including Kansas. Nationwide, the state ranks 3rd for beef production, with nearly 25% of the nation's steaks coming from Kansas. Consumers looking to purchase beef directly from a Kansas rancher can visit kansasbeef.org for a listing of those selling direct to the consumer. I'm Scarlett Higgins.
And that's a quick rundown on today's top stories from the Agricultural News page. In a moment, another visit from K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven. He'll share how he told another individual about why he appreciates Kansas so much. Stop, look, and listen in just a moment. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
I had to wait until they found someone to drive me home.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
The question could be asked, what do you like about our state, Kansas? It's a fair question, as I chose to live here. But I like to rephrase the question and ask, why do you like Kansas? The question, what do you like about Kansas, forces me to make a list and tends to make a statement, what I perhaps don't like about our state. It's an interesting thought process, and I came on it by pure coincidence the other day when a young mechanic drove me home after dropping off my truck at the garage for some minor repair. The dashboard on the truck showed the engine block, which indicated there was something which needed attention. The issue was several oxygen sensors. And I have the constant warning light on that I have a flat tire. I've ignored that light. I kicked the tires. I wish I did not have all that computerized stuff on my truck. Please give me a simple, trustworthy truck. The repairs can be expensive. And for what? What does the mechanic do? My sensor repair was found in the fuses. The report said, found fuses for oxygen sensors are blown and cause an engine light to appear. I used to replace fuses myself in the old truck when went blue. Of course, there is a charge. Like my oldest son says with a smile, Dad, that's what is called maintenance. It should have been a quick repair, but they kept the truck overnight. I stayed friendly and showed understanding because I am a Kansan. I've lived here 46 years. Why do I like Kansas? Because I like its people. Oh, I like its landscapes and changes of the season too. I like the fact that 98% of our Kansas land is privately owned. I love our sky. We have a rural population. That's what I like. Over the years, I've met some special people. They were not famous people, just ordinary Kansans, but they were individuals. Having dropped off the truck, I had to wait until they found someone to drive me home. A young man walked up to me as I walked outside, and he said, "I'll drive you home." We stepped into the service car, and he explained that he was not the regular driver, but gladly would take me home. I gave him directions, and off the lot we drove. After a moment of chit-chat, he said, "If I may ask, where are you from?" For a moment I played with him and I said, "Oh, I'm from Minnesota." But then I said, "No, originally I'm Dutch. But I've lived, worked and studied in Australia before I came to this country in 1959 to work for a Dutch company in North Carolina." Because he seemed genuinely interested, I shared more of my experiences. I then asked him about his work. He was a young mechanic, but he seemed to know his stuff. We talked cars and trucks. He quietly impressed me, and I told him so. And his response was, "No one ever told me that." Hearing that, I continued, not to praise him, but to encourage him to become the best mechanic ever, and always to be honest. We talked and listened to each other, and I could have stayed around him and watched as he was working on an engine. A neat guy. I told him how my children have grown up. Not everyone went to the university, but each of them has found his or her niche. And I admired them. I shared with him how my youngest son is pursuing his career and is building his own equestrian center. He chose not to go to college. As he drove me home, we talked. We talked about learning and learning more to stay current and up to date. He shared that he had no TV, but loved to read to his young daughter. And it was at that instant I thought, what the heck? It so happened that I had a copy of my book in my bag, and I decided to give him that copy when we reached home. And so I did. When he dropped me off at the house, we briefly talked some more, and then I grabbed the book and my pen. I had forgotten his name, so I asked again. I wrote his name in the book and signed it, and I hope he enjoys it. I know that driving me home and us talking made his day. I think it changed his day. It surely made my day. It reminded me that indeed one of the reasons I like our state Kansas is because of its people. They are people with personalities. When the hot, dry summer weather is upon us, I'm sure I will sigh, "Kansas, land of the south wind, please." But we're all in it. Some will have the benefit of AC, while others work outside and just tolerate the heat, and some even enjoy it. But after summer, there will be fall again, and not much can be better than a Kansas autumn. By then, the wheat and maybe the soybeans will have been harvested. The corn will be yellowing, and the hay meadows will have turned green again. The farmers and ranchers will have taken care of the land, and mechanics will have kept the machinery running.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. And so goes our Wednesday edition. For a replay of any of our broadcasts, it's as easy as going to agtoday.net, where those are archived for downloading or for listening on the spot. You can also subscribe to our automatic download podcast service there at agtoday.net. Take advantage of that. Meantime, we'll be right back here this same time tomorrow and hope you'll rejoin us then. Eric Atkinson here from the campus of Kansas State University, bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.